I'll share my slides. Okay, well, today, as I said, I wanted to talk about how to write a minor thesis. And the reason for doing that is because many of you are up to that point in your research projects now. You've mostly collected your data and you've started your analysis and you've started to write. And I thought it was timely to talk about how to write a thesis. I've only got about 20 slides. It won't take too long today, but there's time to discuss your projects if you want to at the end of it, and where you're up to in your writing. I first of all wanted to go to show this slide, which is really about all the steps that are required in doing a research project and writing a minor thesis. And as I was saying to Eleanor before, the first step is to have some idea, and the idea about a topic can be just some interesting observation you've made in the ward, a condition or a disease that interests you, a disease that you think is not well studied, or that you have a question that is yet to be answered. And so it can be simply a clinical observation or an observation about public health. It's most people have not much trouble coming up with an idea. What they have trouble with is turning that idea into a clear research question. And that's the first step, is to try to turn your idea into a research question. Then you should define what the question actually is. Define exactly, objectively, what question you're asking. And it has to be described in an objective way. You can't just say, well, what's the best therapy for scabies or something. That is a good idea, but to turn that into a research question, the question might be, is permethrin better than ivermectin, or does permethrin lead to a greater resolution of scabies at 10 days than ivermectin? So to turn it into something that's objectively measurable is what is generally what's required. You may come up with a hypothesis, that is, one therapy is better than another, or that the causes of neonatal sepsis are. So you don't always have to come up with a hypothesis, but you have to be able to ask a clear research question. It's useful then to do a review of the literature, and that doesn't have to be very complicated. A lot of people spend a lot of time doing literature reviews, and I don't think that's useful, but it is useful to have some idea about what research that other people have done. Maybe the question that you're asking has already been answered, and it's been answered in the context in which you're practicing, so there's not any point in doing it. Or maybe it hasn't been answered, or maybe it's been answered in other environments, but not in PNG, or in difficult environments that are, and so it might be relevant, therefore, to still address that question in your environment. After you've got a research question, then you need to decide on what methodology you use. And this is a really important step, because most people, again, can come up with an idea and they can formulate a research question. But deciding on what sort of methodology to use is very important, because to be able to answer your question in a valid way, you have to use a valid method for that particular question. And so some questions will lend themselves to just observational studies, prospective or retrospective. Some questions will lend themselves to case control studies or cohort studies. So some questions can be looked at in cross-section. You can look at a patient population in cross-section, just do an audit, for example, of children in the ward, or you might need to follow them over a long period of time. It depends on your question. If your question, for example, would be what's the outcome for children who have epilepsy, then you can't simply just look at them in cross-section. You have to follow them over a longer period of time. Similarly for any other sort of chronic disease. So the point is to try to be clear about your question and then design a methodology that answers that. I'll talk a bit about the metrics of measurement. But metrics are just simply units of measurement. So, for example, how we measure respiratory distress, how we measure weight, how we measure height. These might seem simple, but to define your units of measurement is very important at the start. And I'll explain why that's important when we talk about designing a spreadsheet. You then, from your research question or questions, you may have several questions, then you make up some data collection forms. And the data collection forms have to be able to address your research questions. Now, many people, when they're making up their data collection forms, they pad them out with a lot of information on demographics and other things. And that can be important, but it shouldn't overshadow what your research question is. And so sometimes people don't put a lot of effort into their research question and how to address that particular question, and they put more effort into generic things like understanding the patient population in detail. And sometimes those population characteristics are not really relevant to the research question, and sometimes they are. And so it's a matter of having on your data collection form enough information about the patient population that it describes the relevant characteristics to your research question, but not having too many, I think, things about demographics on the research on the data collection forms, especially when it's been answered before. I mean, there's been, for example, there's been so many studies looking at the so-called risk factors for pneumonia or for birth asphyxia, and mostly they ask the same questions of the families or the parents, the mothers, often over and over again. And I think it probably doesn't advance the science very much. So when you're formulating your research question, try to be as original as possible about your question, that not something that's been done before. We should seek ethics approval for any research, especially if if it involves any interventions, and really any major piece of research where you're gathering data from patients. It's important to seek ethics approval for, and that can come in two ways. One, through the School of Medicine and Health Sciences has a medical research technical advisory committee, and they can give approval. And the other way is through the Institute of Medical Research, the MRAC, the Medical Research Advisory Committee. The latter method can take a very long period of time, and so some research projects that don't involve intervention on patients don't need to go through the MRAC. And sometimes you can seek just approval from your hospital might have a review process where you can seek approval from. Mostly sometimes researchers seek funding for their research, but most of our diploma and master's projects are done really on a shoestring. They're not done with any particular funding. But if you're designing a research question that has particular equipments or other things that you need to buy for your research project, then seeking funding is important. I tend to think that most of the DCH and MEd research projects should use the available resources rather than try to seek external funding, because it's just very hard to get funding for those sorts of relatively small projects. You often need to engage others in your research project. And, if you're doing a research project on a particular disease, then, for example, if you're looking at some aspect of neonatal care, then obviously the people who are involved in the special care nurseries at your hospital will need to be engaged. And what I mean by that is informing them of the research project, seeking their suggestions is important so that they feel involved in the project. Similarly, if you're doing a project in the children's wards or the children's emergency department, you should be going and discussing the project, the idea with them, because they may already have thought about the topic. They may already have answers to the questions that you are trying to ask, and they may have other questions that might even be more important. I'm going to say quite a bit about spreadsheets in a little while, because most of you are up to that point. Then you do need to design a spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet should reflect the data in the data collection form. It's very important that when you make up a spreadsheet, whether it's Excel or some other form, then it should reflect
as close as possible the data in the data collection form, and that just makes it easy then to enter your data. You then gather the data, recruit patients, whatever, conduct the study. It's important along the way to develop some sort of analysis plan. And what that means is, once you've come up with your research question and you've come up with a methodology, the analysis plan should be possible to devise. And that means coming up with a way in which you're going to analyze your data. And don't leave that to the end. All of these things that sometimes people do at the end, the analysis should be thought of at the start. It's very important to think of the analysis at the start, because that will enable you to develop a good data collection forms, that it'll enable you to develop a good spreadsheet that can be analyzed. So think about an analysis plan at the start. And I would say that most of the analysis of the research project, the postgraduate research projects, most of them are descriptive epidemiological. It's just simple descriptive epidemiology. I mean clinical epidemiology usually, but just descriptive analysis like frequencies, proportions, sometimes means and medians, and sometimes there's a more complex analysis between if you've done a case control study, or you've got your population is divided up into those who had a good outcome and those who had a bad outcome, then you can do a more complex analysis on that. But mostly it's about a descriptive analysis, fairly simple means and medians and proportions and frequencies and incidences and prevalence, those sorts of things, which I don't have time today to describe all of those definitions, but perhaps we will in another talk. You should commence writing early. In fact, most people do commence writing very early, but they write their proposal. And when you write a proposal, you should realize that you're writing the first draft of your final thesis, right? Because the document that you write for your proposal can be used as, once you've done your proposal, can be used as the master document that you can then modify and build on. You can build, when you've written your proposal, then you should have written the introduction and the methodology, and then you can build on it by adding results and discussion, etc. The reason to say that is because many people start writing very late, and they don't realize that they've actually, along the way, they have written a lot of things that could be included in their final thesis. So just think, if you write a good proposal, that can be the basis for your thesis. When you commence writing, then I think as you're collecting data, it's important to write the introduction and the methods. The methods are a particularly important part of any paper, because the methods tell you exactly what you did. They tell the reader, or the examiner, exactly what you did. And it's very important to write the methods in some detail. When I'm doing a research project, I try to think about, it's linked to an analysis plan, but add into the document what I might call dummy tables. And they're tables that will display your data in the end, in your final thesis, but they don't have any numbers in them. They simply have the variables that you want to describe. I'll show some examples of that at some point. But the reason to do that early is because it helps you understand the sort of data and the analysis, the data that you're going to collect, and the analysis that you're going to do once you've completed all your data collection. So these dummy tables I'll show you in a little while. And then you do the analysis and the writing, and then you finish your thesis. So there's a lot of steps involved, but it's not that complicated, really. I wanted to talk today mostly about writing a thesis, because that's where, as I said, most people are going to be focusing on in the next month, those people who are finishing for the year. And I would say that there's no one right way to write a thesis. There's no fixed structure or fixed components, but this is quite conventional. What I've written here is quite conventional, to have all of these components. You don't need to have necessarily all of them, but most people have most of them. I would say a title page, a declaration that this is your own work. You have to put that in for the university.
Acknowledgements. Some people like to have an acknowledgements page to thank people who've helped them. Then a table of contents, that's important, and I'll try to show you how that can be developed automatically. All right, sometimes people they write it out all manually, and it's not necessary to do that. I'll try to show you how it can be developed automatically. Sometimes people have lists of tables and figures and diagrams, but in most theses you might have 2 tables or 3 tables, and you might have 2 or 3 figures and maybe one other panel or a diagram. It's not like you're writing a book. You don't have to put too much in it, but really focus on the figures and tables that give information in addition to your narrative text. I'll maybe say a bit more about the purpose of tables and figures along the way. Some people think that everything that's in the table needs to be written in the text, and that's not true. In fact, what the table should augment the text. That is, it should be able to contain a bit more detail than you can put in the text. If you wrote everything in the table in the text, it would be rather boring. You'd be writing lots and lots of detail and numbers and things, and the reader would get quite, I think, confused. And so the table often interprets or pulls out the main points that the text, when you write a narrative paragraph, it often pulls out the main points that are actually in your tables, which can contain quite a lot more detail. And again, with figures, usually you might add a figure because that portrays the data in a better way than simply a paragraph of words. And so when you add a figure in a table in your thesis or in any paper you're writing, you should do so because you think it adds to, it helps the reader better understand your data. It's not just there to look good, it's there because you think it may help the reader to understand your data, your results better. That's all. Then you have an abstract. The table of contents, many people won't need a list of tables or figures. In a major thesis like a PhD, you would have that, but I think in most of the minor theses, DCH and master's theses don't have that, but you do need an abstract, and the abstract should be somewhere between 200 and 300 words, no more than that. You should never write an abstract more than 300 words, because an abstract is your opportunity to describe the most important parts of your thesis, and you should be able to describe them in about 250 words, so that it's clear to the reader, to any editor or an examiner, that you understand the real importance of your thesis. Not every detail, because there's a lot of details often that aren't very important or that have been shown elsewhere before, but you understand the main message of your thesis. Right. Then you have your introduction. Some people have a literature review. You don't need to have a literature review necessarily. It can be put in the discussion. The introduction is, when you're writing a paper or a thesis, the introduction is why you did the paper, why you did the study, right? And what I mean by why you did the study, it's the background to why the question is important, right? And it's sometimes people just write many paragraphs on the background to the disease they're studying, and I think that's probably too much, because what the reader wants to know is not so much the background to, let's say you're doing a study on typhoid, and you don't need to write a textbook on typhoid. What you need to do is write an introduction that explains why you chose to study that particular disease in the context in which you're working, right? So why did you study, for example, typhoid among children in Mount Hagen Hospital, for example? That's more important than writing a textbook on typhoid. Okay. So the introduction is why you did the study. As I said, the literature review can go in the discussion. I think it's not necessary in most circumstances to write an extensive literature review, but by the end of your study, by the end of your thesis, you probably will have done a good literature review, and that can that can draw out a lot of papers that can be included in your discussion and in the introduction. The methods is, as I said, is very important, and that's what you did. So the introduction is why you did it, and the methods is what you actually did. And writing that in detail is important. Then there's the results, which we all focus a lot on the results. Again, that's something that you only write at the end of your study, but you can prepare that by doing your analysis plan and having dummy tables constructed and put in your thesis already, even before you've enrolled your last patient. Then there's the discussion, and then usually a final conclusion. Remember the discussion, like, so the introduction is why you did the study, the methods is what you did, the results is what you found, and the discussion is what it means, right? In the discussion, you don't introduce any new results. You can discuss your results. You can say what they mean in the context of the overall question, in the context of research that's been done by other people in other environments. But it's sometimes you'll highlight the gaps in your research, or the limitations of your research, or the strengths of your research. So it's what it means. You might highlight what further research needs to be done, or what policy changes or changes in clinical practice can be introduced on the basis of your research. But if you understand what I'm saying, the discussion is what your results mean. It's not what your results are. What your results are is in the results section, but what your results mean, that's in the discussion. And then a conclusion, which again is, it's better to have a very short conclusion, only a few sentences and one paragraph at most, just I guess stating what the main message of your study is, the main message, right? It's not speculative. You can't speculate. You can only state what the main message is. And then you have your reference list, and then some people have appendices at the end of it. Usually in a thesis, you'll have some appendices, and that might be your data collection form, or it might you might have other tables that you didn't want that you didn't have space to include in your main thesis. You could put at the end. There's lots of things that can go in the appendices that are really not they're part of your overall thesis, but when an examiner or a reader reads it, they don't need to read the appendices to get a full and complete understanding of your study. So that's the structure of a thesis. And yeah, so that's it. It seems very complicated and long, but in fact, if you write a good thesis, it doesn't have to be very long. And some people's theses, well, firstly, there's no fixed length, like there's no fixed structure, there's no fixed length, but sometimes 2,500 to 3,000 words, up to 4,000 words of text, plus the abstract, as I said, 200 to 300 words, plus references, plus tables and figures is all you need. And the advantage of writing a thesis that's maybe up to 3,000 words is that that's about the size of a journal article. So if you've written a good thesis and you want to get it published, then you won't have to cut it down too much to get it to get it in a shape that is adequate for submission for publication. But if you write a 10,000 word thesis, that's not publishable. You would have to cut 7,000 words out of it. And so I think it's probably best to write relatively small theses. That 3,000 words of text is usually plenty. That the text, by text I mean the introduction, the methods, the results, the discussion and conclusions. The other things like the abstract is in addition to that, and the references, that's in addition to that. The tables, they're in addition to that. But 2,500 to 3,000 words of introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusions. That's what you should aim for. Okay. I was going to show you just about searching the literature, and I thought it might be useful if you haven't done it. So I'm going to try to get onto and see if you can see this as well. I'm going to try to get onto PubMed. Now, can you see the PubMed screen, or are you still looking at my other slides?
I'm still on the slideshow.
That's okay. Yeah, I'll stop sharing and then I'll share again, and I'll share the. Okay, now I think you can see the PubMed screen.
Yeah.
Now, some of you will have searched on PubMed. Is like it's the National Library of Medicine. It's similar to Medline. It's got 34 million citations. Tens of thousands of journals are in PubMed, but to do a basic search, I think is useful. I usually do this thing called an advanced search, and that can be helpful. Just to, I'll click on that. You can see the advanced search there. Yep. Okay. So let's say you want to search on a particular topic. So I was interested last week, for example, I wanted to know the side effects of the new medicine called dolutegravir, the integrase strand inhibitor, which is a new medicine for HIV, and it's only come in the last few years. I thought it would be useful to know that. So this is what I did. So I'll just show you the search. Yeah. So dolutegravir is the medicine, and of course I wanted to only know about it in children, right? And so then you can put in, if you put in a big capital letters, it's called Boolean logic. But if you put in big capital letters like that, you'll get only papers that have one term and another term. Okay, if I just searched on dolutegravir, I'd probably get up 50,000 articles. Whereas if I search on dolutegravir in child, right, and I'll just show you something. If you put that little asterisk there, then if the paper has something about child or children, if that tells you that the start of that word, it will search on the start of that word. So any word that's got child in it, children, children's, anything like that. Yeah. And then I'm going to go and adverse effects. Okay. And you'll notice I put adverse effects in capital letters because because those two words, if I just put adverse and effect, then it would search on adverse and effects, but not on that that combination of words, right? Or I might say also or side effects. Sometimes it's useful to put that in quotation marks. So side effects. Let's see what we come up with here, because okay, I haven't done this search before, so we'll just add that and let's just search on that. Okay, now this is uncovered. Let's see, ooh, many papers. I think it's might just start that again and only search on dolutegravir. That came up with a lot of papers. Dolutegravir. See if we can get that spelling right. Dolutegravir. We'll just see how many of these there are. Okay. That's a bit more manageable. There's 180 results. And so it's likely that in these papers, there'll be enough information about the side effects of dolutegravir. So we'd probably, for this, if I wanted to know this, I'd probably go down to a review type article or a major article. What I usually do when I'm looking down is I try to find a paper that's published in a very reputable journal. So I would first of all go to this one because it's published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and that's a very well-known and reputable journal. So I would go to this one, and that's likely to be a large trial of dolutegravir as first and second line treatment for HIV-1 infection in children. You can see it's got both terms.
And from that, it's likely to be that we'd find the results. Let's just go to this one and see if we can. From here, you can read the abstract of the paper, right? And you can see this was a trial that involved 707 children and adolescents who had HIV. Anyway, that's the way you can do it. Now, this search uncovered 180 papers. And so what I'd usually do is just scan them with my eyes, just going through, picking out the ones that I thought were important. So that's the start of a type of. Let's just go back to my. Okay. Right. So I just wanted to show you PubMed briefly. There's many more things you can do with PubMed, search on lots of different things, but it's good to be able to do a basic search and find some papers that might help you with your initial research question. You can make it even more specific. For example, you could put in dolutegravir and child and Papua New Guinea if you wanted to know if any papers were written about the use of that drug in PNG. I looked at that the other day, and there hadn't been any papers written about it, of course. But you can do that if you searched on, for example, diarrhea and children and Papua New Guinea. You'd find lots of papers, or pneumonia in child in Papua New Guinea, or malaria in child in Papua New Guinea. You'd find lots of papers on those things. So you can narrow your search down, so you don't have to search through so many articles. But it's useful to start broad first and then narrow down further. Right. Now, I wanted to somebody ask a question. Oh. Roy, can you see the screen now? Alina, can you see the screen?
Yes, I can see.
Okay. Yeah. So I wanted to talk about now about the data collection forms you have in spreadsheets, partly because I see a lot of problems with the way people construct their data collection forms or their spreadsheets. But basically, the questions that you have identified should be objective, right? They should be measurable in some way. I will talk about qualitative research because that's becoming more important. But to start with, we'll talk mostly about quantitative research. The questions should be objective, and the methods, as I've said, should be appropriate to the question. When you've come up with your idea and you've thought about turning it into an objective question, it's useful to then consult someone, just ask, what sort of method would I need to answer this question, right? That's the important thing. What method would I need to answer this question? And you can design the method then. The data collection form that you make up should reflect your questions, right? You should be able to read your data collection form and say, oh, this is how I'm going to answer this particular question. And then the spreadsheet should reflect your data collection form almost precisely. That is, everything that's on your data collection form there should be a field, a column, or etc. on your spreadsheet. And a spreadsheet should be analysable to answer your questions, right? So they're the rules, if you like. So the spreadsheet should reflect your data collection form, and it should be in more or less the same order as your data collection form. So it's ideal to have the columns in the same order so that when you're entering the data, it's much easier to do so. Mostly people have, if they're studying patients, they'll study each row on their spreadsheet will be a patient, and their variables will be in columns. And then the next thing is, there are different types of variables, right? Clinical things that you might measure. So there are continuous variables, that things like weight and age and time or duration of cough, for example, or duration of illness or duration of fever. They're all continuous variables, okay? Because they're on a continuum, aren't they? A continuum that goes from 0 to much higher numbers. There are some variables that are binary. So, for example, yes or no. So if you're recording, did the child have the clinical signs of heart failure, then that's yes or no. They either did or they didn't, as you've defined clinical signs of heart failure. Or was the child anemic? Yes or no? And so they're I suppose, for example, the anemia one could be asked in two ways, couldn't it? You could ask the question, what's the hemoglobin? That's a continuous variable. Or is the child anemic? That's a binary variable. And it depends whether you're looking at clinical anemia or whether you're looking at the hemoglobin. You might also include both of those, one as a continuous variable and one as a binary variable, and they would make up two columns in your spreadsheet. So it's just important to try to work out from the start which of your variables that you're recording on your data collection form are continuous variables and which ones are binary variables. And then there's a few variables that are categorical. So let's see, if you had, for example, you were measuring, so I know Dr. Roy Eager did a study, and he reported a Likert score that tells whether or not health workers liked using the early warning sign monitoring chart that he had. And the Likert score is categorical. It's also, I guess, continuous, but it's different categories of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's both continuous and categorical, I suppose. What I mean by categorical is it can be divided up into different categories. A lot of the time people try, the main reason to mention this is because people often try to convert their continuous data into categories, and that's not a good idea. So, for example, if you're recording a birth weight, for example, birth weight is a continuous variable, but sometimes people on their spreadsheet or on their data collection form, they put like less than 1,500 grams, 1,501 to 2,000 grams, 2,000 to 2,500 grams. They'll do something like that. And that's not a good idea, because you then lose data. You lose the ability to make more analysis of the data, to calculate means and medians of the data. So don't change continuous variables into categorical variables until the very end. You might want to present it as categorical variables in your thesis, in the final result of your thesis, but don't do it at the start. Okay. Now, a lot of these continuous variables like weight and length and head circumference or mid-upper arm circumference, duration of illness, you should just decide at the start how many decimal points you'll go to. Now, it depends on how many decimal points you record to, depends on the number of patients or number of subjects you have in your study, and also it depends on the precision of your measurement. So, for example, if you're measuring weight of newborn babies, you can't measure that to a precision of like 0.1 grams. You might be able to measure it to 1 gram, but you can't go down to 0.1 grams. So I've seen, for example, people have like 1,760.6 grams. Well, no scales we've got measures down to that precision. So you have to decide how many decimal places you'll use. Similarly, with measuring, say, head circumference, you could probably measure the point to 1 millimeter. Can't you? You could measure like to 35.6 centimeters, right? 35.6. So, but you can't measure to any more precisely than that. So don't add more decimal places if your method of measurement isn't any more precise, right? And you should then measure all your subjects to exactly the same number of decimal places. It could be none, or it could be 1, or it could be 2, depending on your unit of measurement, but do it all in the same way. Don't record some as centimeters and some as millimeters. That mixes it up and makes it very complicated. Yeah, I think I've talked about all that. Okay, I wanted to show you first of all, a bad example of a spreadsheet. And this is I see this quite often. It's not bad. It just means it's just very, very hard to analyze. And I'll just explain what parts of it need to be fixed up. You might look at this and say, well, this is an Excel spreadsheet and it looks okay, but no, it's not really analyzable. Firstly, a lot of people have a lot of different rows that describe their variables. Well, when you're doing your analysis, any analytical programs won't understand that. They'll only understand that there's one row at the top, which is your variable names. So don't put like 2 rows or 3 rows I've seen describing variable names. You just have to have one row at the top that describes variable names. The second thing is, you can see here that people have put, let's say for sex, they've put F, M, 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 F, male, sometimes female. So sometimes they've written the child's sex in as a letter, and sometimes they've written the full word. You have to use uniform metrics. And so it could be M or F, or it could be 1 or 0, as long as you've defined those. It doesn't matter, but just use uniform metrics. A similar example of that is the age. And some of these ages are written in days, some of them are in months, some of them are in months that where the number and the letters combine. No, the point is, no data collection form, no data analytical program can ever analyze that. It has to be just a number. Here there's the blood pressure's been measured and it's 90/30. Now that's okay to record it like that, but it can't be analyzed like that. So you need to then separate those to systolic blood pressure 90 and diastolic blood pressure 30. Yeah. Similarly for weight, they've recorded as kilograms and grams. Sometimes they haven't got a metric. Duration of cough, sometimes there's no metric, 20 something or 7 days or 1 week, and sometimes question mark. No analytical program will be able to analyze that. Here for diagnosis, they put things like multiple diagnoses in the one in the one column. So sometimes they put severe malnutrition, sometimes they put SAM. So they've described the same thing in different ways, and that's just not analyzable, right? Similarly with outcome, I'll just move this over here. Similarly with outcome, there's survived, discharged, DC sometimes. So it's using different metrics and different ways of, you need to standardize the way you describe all your data and use numbers where you can. Don't put in the unit of measurement. The unit of measurement can go up in the title if you have trouble remembering it. But here, these should all be numbers. Otherwise, no analytical program can analyze it. I'll show you now a better example, right, of a data collection form. So this is the same data collection form improved, separated out. So the patient number is still there. The names are the same. Sex is made now 0 and 1. So 1 for males, 0 for females. It could be the other way around, doesn't matter. The point is to have it so it's easily analyzable. Then you can count up the number of children that are male and the number that are female. The age here, instead of being sometimes in days and sometimes in months, is all in months. And so 1 to 123. So that's many years, isn't it? That's like 10 years. The child would have to be 10 years and 3 months of age, but it's in months, so that the numbers are comparable. Here, the child's less than 1 month, so that the 0.6 must be like 3 weeks, about 2.5 or 3 weeks. And so instead of writing 2.5 weeks, which would be not comparable with the other the other data, then the research has written 0.6. Okay. And similarly here, for a child who's only 1 week of age, 0.25 months. All right. So it's all a fraction of a month. Now here, instead, in the last one, it said neonate 1, no, 1. It doesn't make sense. You just have to write it 1 or 0. 1 is yes, 0 is no. If you remember here, there was all these mixed up diagnoses, pneumonia, malnutrition, sometimes the pneumonia written in lots of different ways, or malaria. The only way to analyze that sort of data is to separate them out into separate columns. It sometimes means you've got a very long spreadsheet, but that's okay. At least you've got it in an analyzable form. So the children that had pneumonia, they get a 1. Those that didn't have pneumonia, they get a 0. Similarly for malaria, for HIV, for malnutrition, for sepsis. This was a study of oxygen saturation levels, I think, in children who were presenting, all children presenting. And so the multiple diagnoses were relevant. Here, as I said, you can't analyze something that's got a number over another number in the spreadsheet. It has to be just a single number. So systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure. The weight, again, is in kilograms, but to 1 decimal place in most cases, right? And the cough duration in days. So again, there's not, just to be clear, most analytical programs can't detect a number and letters in the one variable, in the one cell. They just have to have a number or letters. If you just want to write, letters, want to write words, that's okay, like for name. But if you're wanting to analyze it, work out the median or the mean or the frequency of something, the frequency of neonates in the study or the frequency of children with HIV, then it's got to be just numbers. And to work out the mean or the median of, say, weight, it's got to have all the same metric. Okay, I hope that's clear. Yeah. This was another very good spreadsheet that was just from last year. I thought it was excellent in the way it was constructed, just categorical binary outcomes were 1s and 0s. Continuous variables were measured in single units of measurement, just in numbers, etc. So saturation measured just, again, no decimal places for saturation because the pulse oximeter doesn't tell you that. So it's simply just an analyzable spreadsheet. So, okay. I've said most of this in my comments on these spreadsheets, but first of all, don't separate your continuous variables into categories, right? So the number of people in a household, less than 4, 5 to 8, greater than 8, that loses data because then you can't calculate the mean or the median. So don't do that until maybe the very end, if you want to at the very end. And as I said, if for example you put these signs like a less than or greater than sign, a computer can't understand what that means. They can't understand a less than or greater than. So you'll never be able to analyze that. You may want to categorize things later, number of people in the household or duration of cough or whatever, but not for data entry and the initial analysis. Do it later if you need to. I've said already that you should use the same metric of measurement consistently in a variable. So don't record age in months for some and years for others. Just record it in days or weeks or months, whatever's relevant to that patient population. If they're mostly over the age of 1 year, then you would normally record it in years to 1 decimal place or year or months, for example. You wouldn't record it in days usually, because we usually don't know exactly how many days a child's been alive. We usually know what their age is in years. So it depends on the precision of the method of measurement as to what you record. So if you record in months, then 6 months is 6. 1 month, 1 year, 8 months is like 12 plus 8, so that's 20. 5.5 years is 60 months plus 6 months, so 66. 2 weeks is 0.5. A newborn baby on day 1 is 1/30th of a month, isn't it? So that's 0.03. So there are ways of even recording like small and large numbers just using the same metric. And then it seems I'm laboring this point, but it makes things much more analyzable when you get around to the the final part of analyzing. I talked about before creating dummy tables, and I'll maybe show some of these, just a couple of examples of these. Most papers that you read have 2 or 3 tables, usually one with the demographics of the population that's being studied, and 1 or 2 with the results, just the key results. And I wanted to show you some dummy tables of, this was a study of that Dr. Michael Landy, the pediatrician, did of severe malnutrition at Port Moresby General Hospital. And when he did this study, I'll just explain what he did. He did, first of all, a baseline survey of all the patients in the wards, all the wards who had malnutrition. And then a month later, 1 month or 2 months later, he did a post-intervention survey. And then 2 months after that, he did another post-intervention survey. And so when he thought about writing up his thesis and working out an analysis plan, he developed these dummy tables. And you can see that the dummy tables provide the information about each of the different patient populations, because the children he was looking at in the first survey were different to those in the second survey, so the first post-intervention survey, and were different to those in the second post-intervention survey. In between the first and second survey, he did an intervention which was educational to try to improve the management of children with severe malnutrition, but they end up being different patients, right? And so certain things you would look at and you'd say, well, some of them are continuous variables and some of them are binary variables. For example, the age, the age that you present, that's a continuous variable, so you might present it as a median, right, in months and the interquartile range. The number of males or females, that would be as a proportion, wouldn't it, as a frequency or proportion. Again, the median length of stay is a continuous variable, and you could present it as a median. Things like comorbidity, that's a binary variable, so it's just 1 or 0, or and it becomes a frequency or proportion in when you're making up your tables, right? These are proportions or frequencies. And so this was finally, when he had finished the study, he was able to put in the data. So in the first survey, he looked at 125 children, second survey 120 children, and the third survey 118 children. They were all different children. And this is the proportion that had severe malnutrition. So the number and the percentage with severe malnutrition in each of the surveys, and the median age in months. So it was 24, 17, 17. The proportion that were males, so there's a predominance of males, for example, the greater percentage of males, the median length of stay, and the frequencies and percentages that had all these diseases. And you can see that by developing a dummy table like this without any data in it, it helps you understand just what the analysis is going to be and how you're going to present your data, right? So he had so 2 tables, and one was a table of demographics and one was a table of results. This was the other dummy table that we developed for his results. And this was, so for example, I'll just explain it. The average duration it took to initiate feeding in the survey at baseline, at the first survey and the second survey, and the volume of feeds that children received. And you can see from this that at baseline, they didn't get much in the way of feeds, but after the intervention, they got a lot more. And the difference between the baseline and the follow-up surveys was significant. And the same for the number of calories that children received and the weight gain the children had, much greater in the follow-up surveys. So the point I wanted to make was really about the dummy tables and how you can construct them while you're thinking about how to present your data. And yeah, and then you can fill it in later when you do your analysis. Okay, right. I've nearly finished, but I wanted to just say, I mentioned this before, but try to have a single master document that can be used for your proposal and your thesis and your manuscript. Obviously, you will save it as a different thing, but to start with, don't you don't need to start from the start when you're writing your thesis, because you've already written your introduction and your methods. Now, often you need to change and add to your methods or add to your introduction, but at least you've done some writing beforehand, so that that doesn't get wasted. I say keep your supervisor informed and interested in your study, and keep talking to people about it. Back up your data and your documents. That's very important. We've had many people that have lost their data over the years. Now, I just wanted to comment on the writing style. And I said that I see a lot of theses, or read a lot of theses that are very, very large, like 10,000 words, and mostly people can write them a bit more concisely. You don't need to write a very large thesis. And so write as concisely and as, write as concisely as you can. Not with very long sentences that have more than one idea. Each sentence should have one idea. That's a sort of rule of the English language. It's not just a rule of writing a scientific paper, but any sentence should contain one idea. And all the sentences in a paragraph should be linked in some way. They should, one idea from one sentence should extend on to the next sentence. There should be some cohesion between them. Don't use jargon or slang. The way we talk is not the way we write, and it is important that you try to remove like slang or jargon, or and write in a more precise way, I would say. However, you can use verbatim quotes if you're doing qualitative research. That's very important, and often the quotes that you have from your participants in your study, you can use them in your research, and you can use them verbatim, even if they are slang or they're in we've had some very good qualitative research projects done in recent years where people have used quotes from their participants that to illustrate the participants' perception of certain things, their care-seeking behaviour or their understanding of their disease and that sort of thing. I wanted to say something about abbreviations. Try to not to use them. I see them used too often, and often, usually they just make people confused. You should really only use generally accepted abbreviations. So, we all know about many abbreviations like WHO. That makes sense to people, what WHO means or what MDR-TB means. Whenever you use an abbreviation, even if it's a relatively accepted abbreviation, the first time you use any abbreviation, you must define it. So, for example, the child was found to have multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, MDR-TB, on GeneXpert and later TB culture. So the reason to do that is because then the reader will understand what all your abbreviations mean, and you're not using an abbreviation without defining it. I try never to use ambiguous abbreviations. So some people use commonly TOF. TOF, could that be tetralogy of Fallot, or it could be tracheoesophageal fistula? Both of them are called TOF, and it's just wrong to use abbreviations where there's an ambiguous meaning to them. So the most important thing I've told you is use generally accepted abbreviations. Try not to use ones that are ambiguous, and the first time you use the abbreviation, you must define it. Now, convention when you're writing means that you don't define it in the abstract. You usually don't use abbreviations in your abstract. You define it the first time you use it in your introduction or your methods or your results or your discussion. Then you define it in those sections, but in your abstract, better not to use abbreviations. Okay. I was going to show you the way in which Word can help you generate headings and subheadings, and if we've got time, I wanted to show you that. If we've got time to look at that, I hope you can see this. I'm not sure whether I'll be able to do this, but can get this on the side. Oh yeah, okay. I hope you can see this this paragraph. It says a high prevalence of rheumatic heart disease, RHD, has been shown in many island nations in the Pacific and in other countries. The World Health Organization has written guidelines on RHD relevant to low and middle income countries. These guidelines include benzathine penicillin prophylaxis. There have been recent reports of adverse reactions to benzathine penicillin, among a small number of children with RHD. Now, the way you can reference that is if you have a program called EndNote, and there are many different forms of reference managers. This I wanted to show you how you can use this program called EndNote. And other reference programs are a bit similar. So I'm going to go to my EndNote. Can you see the EndNote program now? Or are you still seeing the text?
I'm still on the text.
On the text, okay. I'm going to stop sharing that and try to share the EndNote. And we'll see if it works, yeah. I'll show you. So now you can see EndNote, yeah?
Not yet.
It's a database.
It's still loading, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So now you can see it, yeah. So this is a database that if you're doing research, you might develop an EndNote database that has all the papers in it that you've read or you've included in journal articles you've written or in your thesis. And as I say, there are many different programs like this, but I wanted to show you, for example, if you're, let's see, I'm going to try to cite one of these references, and that's about rheumatic heart disease, right? So I'm going to try to put that into my document. Let's see if that goes in. Yes. Now, can you see the document or not yet?
Not yet.
No. Okay. Well, I'll stop sharing and I'll just show you. I'll show you the EndNote. Screen. Okay, you can probably see the document again, and it's automatically been updated with the reference from the World Health Organization, and it's given it a number. And so if I then put in another reference, then it'll add that number to the document. This you can do your references by hand if you like, but if you're someone who thinks they might do some more research later on, it's good to have a program like EndNote. There is a program that's similar to this in Word that can do something similar to that. I'm just going to go back and show you. Okay. So I've shown you the maybe at some other time. Look, I think it's probably we might stop there, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about how to write a thesis. I think there's a lot more things we can learn, but often you only learn these things as you're doing it. Each step of the way, you'll learn these techniques to efficiently write a thesis. But that's all I wanted to say today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks.